Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bev Lang. I'm the Executive Officer with Elder Abuse Action Australia. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have joined us today. For myself, I live on Darkinjung land, which is an hour and a half north of Sydney. Welcome to today's very special edition of Lunch and Learn. They're normally sessions that are a platform for EAAA's members to share their insights, projects and research. However, it's June, it's close to the 15th of June, and this panel that we've gathered to have a discussion with three of Australia's most respected voices in advocacy and human rights, Commissioner Robert Fitzgerald, Dr. Kay Patterson and Russell Westacott. And Vivian's going to speak a little bit more to their background in a moment. Today's event is a lead-in to the launch of EAAA's 2026 conference, which is themed Stand Up, Speak Out, because silence is never the solution. It's also a couple of days away from World Elder Abuse Awareness Day on the 15th of June. So two very special occasions for the gathering of this webinar. Our moderator today is Vivian Schenker. Vivian is a media and communications professional with nearly 40 years experience across broadcasting, politics and the not-for-profit sector. A former journalist and presenter at the ABC and SBS, she hosted Insight on SBS TV and Radio National Breakfast on the ABC. She later served as the Senior Communications Director in Federal Politics before leading Media and Communications at the Australian Red Cross. Vivian is currently Deputy Chair of 2RPH, a radio reading service. And in fact, she's off air this afternoon to do some reading on the radio station. So welcome to you all, particularly our panel, and I'm now going to hand over to Vivian.
Thanks for that introduction, Bev. I'm thrilled to be moderating this really important discussion, and I guess we should get started straight away with an introduction of all our illustrious panel members today. First, as Bev mentioned, Commissioner Robert Fitzgerald AM, Age Discrimination Commissioner, who was appointed in April 2024. He's well known for his work in social justice, human services reform and systemic advocacy, and is a highly respected lawyer, human rights and social justice advocate, and a leading figure in public and social policy areas. He was the inaugural New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commissioner, having served as a Commissioner on the Royal Commission into the Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. Dr. Kay Patterson, AO, also EAAA patron, former Age Discrimination Commissioner, and long-standing advocate for the rights of older Australians. She is a former federal senator and cabinet minister who served as Minister for Health and Ageing and Minister for Family and Community Services. She was Australia's Age Discrimination Commissioner from 2016 to 2023, focusing on ageism, elder abuse and older women at risk of homelessness. Also with us today, Russell Westacott, a long-time human rights advocate, known for his leadership in LGBTIQ+ ageing and aged care. He served as CEO of Seniors' Rights Service for a decade and was one of the founders of EAAA. Russell has also contributed to international efforts on the rights of older people through the UN Working Group on Ageing, and he currently sits on the Aged Care Council of Elders. So a big welcome to all three of you. Just a quick housekeeping couple of things before we open the conversation. Can I ask you to use the chat function to ask any questions or make comments? Obviously, we'd like you to be as respectful as possible in your interactions with each other and the speakers. As we have multiple presenters for this session, please include the name of the presenter your question is directed to in the chat. Each presenter will respond to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation, but if your question isn't answered during the session, we'll endeavour to compile all of those together and share the responses with everyone who registered. Should you need captions, please click on the Show Captions button on the bottom of your screen. So let's get into it. And Robert, I'm going to start with you. When did you first decide to speak out about an issue that you felt strongly about?
Well, it may come as a surprise to many of you that if I look back on my schooling days and university days, my life of advocacy would not have been predicted. I was very quiet. I didn't do speech making. I didn't do debating. I didn't join any activist group when I was at university. But the one thing I did do was to join as a volunteer with one of the Catholic charities that was visiting very vulnerable, very impoverished families in the inner city. And the very first speech that I ever had to give publicly was to several hundred of members of that organisation. And the challenge for me was I'd come to a view that the way in which we were working with vulnerable families, low income and socioeconomically disadvantaged families, was entrapping them in poverty and disadvantage. It seemed to me that what we needed to do, together with organisations like the Salvation Army or Mission Australia, whatever it was, is to help people move out of poverty, out of disadvantage. And that was the presentation. And most people in the audience were at least 30 to 40 years older than me. So speaking up, even in an audience within the organisation, I can't have done such a bad job because some years later I became state president of that organisation. But the other thing I remember about it, my voice was perfectly fine, I was perfectly fine, but my leg was shaking. And as I gave the presentation, a water jug on the table next to me kept shaking, and the water started to splash ever more violently during the whole speech. So I hope I presented well, but it was, in a sense, the start of speaking out about issues around social justice, inequality and disadvantage, and that seems to have been a lifelong passion. But it wasn't predicted if you looked at my earlier years.
Kay, what about you? You didn't start that early either, did you?
Well, I think I started reasonably early. I was about 13 or 14. And I obviously my staff and friends say, oh, she was a girl guide, that's why she does that. I was very keen girl guide. I wanted to be a girl guide from when I was about 7. I couldn't get in until I was about 10 and a half or 11. And my patrol was chosen as one of the best patrols, the 14 best patrols in New South Wales. And I was living then in public housing in Surrey Hills, not the sort of area that it is now. And one of the girls in my patrol had a father who was an alcoholic, and we raised some money so all of us could go to this camp, and our leader made us shorts and shirts, and he said she couldn't go. And the leader said to me, well, you need to go and talk to him. I didn't know why she wouldn't go, but I had to go and talk to him and say why I thought she should go. He was a violent, angry person, and I had to go and say, well, all of us have raised money. We've all needed some help, and I want her to be part of our group because she was part of the group that won the opportunity to go. He was very resistant, and I stood up to him as a 14-year-old and said, well, I think it's unfair that she can't come with us because she's worked hard. And finally he caved in, and that was my first victory, I suppose, in advocacy for somebody else. I still remember she was a little tiny, failure to thrive kid, skinny as a rake, and one of the other girls' mother was a local abortionist in around Surrey Hills. So I had an interesting group of kids that I was leading, and we all got to go. But it was the first time, and I think it was right that the leader sent me. I was scared. I was so scared when I knocked on the door, but it was an interesting thing. And I think it led me to understand that you can't be silent, you've got to stand. It would have been easier to say, oh, well, a dad won't let her go. But I didn't think that was the right thing to do. So I started early. I was like Robert. I was so busy trying to, as a mature age student, I didn't do much at university. But I think I've advocated for people, particularly older people. I've had a passion for issues affecting older people from when I was very young, and I don't know where it came from, but I think from a paternal grandma and a paternal grandfather and a maternal grandmother who were I idolised. And I think that's another thing we don't do is advocate for the role of grandparents in socialisation of children.
Okay, Russell, what about you? How old, roughly
well,
how old? What motivated you?
In the mid-80s, I was 21 or 22. It was the beginning of the HIV epidemic. Technology had just advanced where testing for HIV became available in Australia. I remember going for an HIV test, and I think it was 86. And I discovered that I was HIV positive. And of course, that was at a time when there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of unease in the community around HIV. And for me, I knew that it was something, if I was going to be able to deal with it, it couldn't be something that I could deal with by myself. And even though it was extraordinarily hard for me as a young gay man who grew up in Western Sydney, I needed to tell somebody that I was HIV positive. And I put that trust in a friend of mine who is still a very good friend. And I used that person as somebody who I was confident I would get support from, and indeed I did. And that then gave me strength and courage to reach out to other people. It gave me strength and courage and confidence to start connecting with community-based organisations that were springing up in response to the HIV epidemic. And I started becoming involved as a volunteer. I then got some paid positions in some HIV organisations in Sydney. And so it was that sort of journey of my own vulnerability and seeing and feeling the rewards of reaching out, getting support, putting trust in people, and having those people have your back. And that enabled me to spend most of my adult life since then either advocating for others, advocating for community, advocating for a range of things. And as you said in the introduction, so I've worked in LGBTI rights and also the rights of older people more recently.
So you talked there a little bit about some of the rewards you got from it, but what about the costs, Russell? There must have been costs for a 21-year-old man speaking out publicly about an issue that was very sensitive in parts of the community.
Sure. I mean, I suppose it's fair to say that not everybody I reached out to was supportive. And it was very difficult territory to try and very difficult terrain to try and sort of get your footing in. But so yes, there were some costs in doing it, but I think the rewards outweighed the costs. Yeah.
What about UK? You, I think, have seen situations, haven't you, where people have felt costs from, opening themselves out and advocating on behalf of others?
Yes, I have. And it's not always advocating on behalf of others. It's also advocating on a principle maybe brings attention to you. And one of the examples I chatted to you about when we were discussing this program was a lecturer I had in child development back in 1996. And she showed us a black and white 16mm video, a film, not a video, film, of children in America who'd been abused. So we learned to see the signs, which has actually helped me with adults in a funny sort of a way. But she showed us the film, We then went off to our other lecturers in educational psychology, who then were openly critical of her, saying, this is ridiculous, she's alarmist, you don't need to see this sort of stuff, it only happens in America. And it made me think about what happens with older people, and I guess that pushed me hard when I was teaching human development to physiotherapists and allied health professionals at Lincoln Institute, which is now at La Trobe, to push for and advocate for courses in adult development in gerontology, because many of these students were going to work for young people. So it was advocating in a different sort of way, but on a principle of education. The other area was when I was in Parliament, we had a stem cell debate. We had a bill that went through on stem cells, and we said we'd have a review committee. The review committee met over a period of a year, and the cabinet was not of a mind to implement the recommendations. And I thought that was an appalling principle when we'd asked people to do it, that the Parliament should be mature and adult enough to actually discuss it. So I developed a private members bill, and that brought enormous criticism to me because it was about cloning. People would get up out of the dining room and leave the dining table when I came in. And I believe, I didn't necessarily think we should have all the recommendations, but I thought we should have the adult debate in Parliament about it. So the principle of giving the Parliament a chance to debate these recommendations outweighed the issues itself, but also outweighed the fact that Cabinet had a different decision from me. I'd left Cabinet. I found that quite personally challenging and affronting, but I believed it was the right thing to have the Parliament discuss it, because in 20 years' time, when there's some outrageous thing and people go, woo, the Parliament people will say, well, I was on a committee, or my boss was on a committee, I'm not going to actually do that because that was too costly for everybody involved in the review and the people who put it up. And that's why when I went to see the Prime Minister and said, we need to have the adult debate, that he supported me in that. So, but it was quite personally challenging and quite personally disappointing that some people took it personally and were really quite rude. And I received cartoons and bad and quite nasty emails and stuff. So there's a price to be an advocate, not necessarily always about people, but sometimes about principles.
Robert, have you seen that as well?
Yes, and I think if you choose a life of advocacy in its different forms, there are costs. In my own circumstances, I'm one of the most privileged people you can have. A white male born in the 1950s is about as privileged in society as you can get. Very different from the people that I advocated with and for, who were obviously mostly very disadvantaged. But even in my own circumstances, there's the obvious cost in terms of the jobs that you can take and not take relative to the sort of advocacy you've had. There's personal security issues. When I was president of ACOS, a whole lot of people don't agree with your policies, and some of them will come up to you in the street and say so. You have to have private numbers. You can't have an open access telephone numbers. The family is impacted by the criticism that comes from Australia's shock jocks, which was regular and unrelenting in the Sydney market. That comes at a cost to you, your family and your children, who don't understand why you're being so viciously attacked. But the thing that I learned very early, all of that pales into insignificance of the actual people that we were representing and working with. And so when I was president of ACOS, we always worked with people that had the lived experience, older people, sole parents, unemployed people, and their challenges in life and their challenges as advocates are much greater. Where I could work with those people was to give them strength, to give them voice. And so, yes, there is a cost of advocacy, but for those that are actually got that lived experience, it's a much greater cost that they have to bear. And the risks and the safeguarding that is needed to moderate those risks is very important to understand. One of the things I'm always very conscious of is if people that are, particularly those that have suffered abuse, sexual abuse or elder abuse or others, who come forward and be an advocate, they need to be supported and protected in a very special way, because the journey they're on can be very tough.
I want to talk about what some of those protections might be a little later on. But first, I want to ask you about the huge explosion in social media. Has that made the cost of standing up speaking your mind, speaking out on controversial subjects even more difficult?
Oh, absolutely. In my days, they'd write you a letter, they'd write letters to the editor, they'd ring up the local talkback radio show. All of that's manageable in its own way. Nowadays, much of the social media is now toxic. And so, in a sense, advocates have to work out how to navigate that space. There's a couple of rules about that. The first is you don't have to engage in it all, and you shouldn't, because all you're doing is fodder for their vengeance and their hatefulness. And you've got to pull yourself back and say, I don't want to be part of that. I mean, there were radio programs that we banned from actually appearing on for the same thing. Now in social media, it's much worse. The second thing with social media, it's very personal. It's not attacking the issues or the principles that you stand for. It's actually full-on attack on the individual. And you have to safeguard yourself from that. So I think you've got to be much more selective about the media you watch, read, access, and the media you use, because the other side of that story is all advocates need to use social media to get their stories out. But the field is immeasurably more difficult. And for people that have lived experience that come out, talking about their sexual abuse or their abuse in family and domestic violence or what have you, there's a whole group of people that are out there to attack those individuals, just waiting. So the space is much more difficult. Nevertheless, you have to develop the skills to be able to navigate that if you want to be an effective advocate. Russell,
is that something you've come across too?
Yeah, no, I suppose what was going on in my mind when Robert was talking is I completely agree with him in regard to social media. But I think when we're bringing this back and talking about older people, that there are a lot of organizations that are that I think older people can put their trust in, and they may not be obvious advocacy organizations, but for example, local bowling clubs. I just want to use that as an example. They're not really seen as advocacy organizations, but nonetheless, there's a bunch of people there who I'm sure that people could put their, if they're a member of a bowling club, that they could put their trust in, and from there, that small network of people could grow and make contact with an advocacy organization to support an individual. So it doesn't have to be something that you do by yourself, but something that you strategically build a bit of a network or a buffer around you. And that can be from any sort of club or any group of people that get together, and it doesn't. You don't have your first step doesn't have to be to an advocacy organisation, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, we've had a comment from one of our viewers stroke listeners saying social media is now the platform to raise issues, and it appears we have lost the ability to engage face to face. It's as if we seek supporters to validate our attempts to address issues. Is that how you see it too, Kay? Do you want to talk to that?
Well, I think the social media has opened the floodgates. I mean, when I first entered public life, and I guess Parliament's pretty public, people were a little bit more cautious about what they wrote. They were a bit more cautious about what they said in the press, because people could sue them for defamation. Now on social media, people say the most, sometimes I am shocked at the most outrageous things people say without any sort of consequences or any thought about the individual that they're besmirching or criticising. And I don't know that we've learnt to navigate it all that well, and because it's, to be the recipient of that sort of flood of negative comments is for some individuals soul destroying. And yet I don't know that we've learnt to deal with the changes that social media have brought in terms of the sort of criticism, the sort of comments that can be made with no consequences at all. And I think that is a challenge for people who want to advocate and speak out, and it could be a thing that silences people. I hope it doesn't, and I think we've got to be, those of us who really want to advocate, have thick enough skins to go, I don't care what and Robert was saying, ignore them. Don't give them, don't give them oxygen to feel that they've hurt you or upset you. If you believe the principle is so important to protect someone's right or to raise an issue that you think is wrong, is absolutely vital that you don't get sort of terrified or intimidated by the terrible comments that people will put towards you. And I've talked to some of my former colleagues about some of the stuff that's happened to them, and they are hurt to the bone often by what's said.
I can imagine, and as a couple of you have mentioned, the most vulnerable people to that sort of pressure and abuse are often those with lived experience, who are the stories that are most crucial to, pushing for social change. What can be done to mitigate some, if you like, of those risks and costs, even if you never are going to mitigate all of them?
Can I just say, I think what Russell said is really important. One of the things that is clear, and I've now been in many organisations that have advocated, and in different ways, that mutual support is really important. A lot of people say to people, oh, you should get up and you should do this. And I've heard that of child sexual abuse victims. Be very careful. It is a risky business to be an advocate if you're talking about your own personal experiences. Some people are extraordinary at doing that, and we've seen it, and they're worthy of all of our commendations, but others are not so safe. And so what Russell said is very important. The use of advocacy groups, working within other organisations, they give you a support, but they also give you the techniques to navigate this space. Raw advocacy, just getting up and thinking what you say on the spur of the moment, frankly, is not what we're talking about. That's just venting what you feel. Good advocacy is an art that you develop over time. And for people that have not been in that space, that support that Russell talks about, I think is critical. And I'm a patron of a number of organisations, one of which is about child sexual abuse victims. That organisation allows people to be advocates in their own life and in their own cause, but it does so with a degree of safety. Not completely safe, not completely risk-free. But, I urge people, if they're going to do that, to be part of groups just as Russell and Kay have been part of.
So it's a question, at least partly, of picking your target. You don't have to advocate out there to the general public all the time. Is that the gist, Russell? Is that what you would suggest?
Yeah, yes. I think it's about starting small, finding somebody that you can trust, and that could be a neighbour, it could be a friend, it could be a family member, and from there, use that as stepping stones to maybe tell the story to other people, maybe bring that person with you to some sort of rights-based organisation who might be able to give you some further assistance. And when we're talking about individuals who are coming forward with their stories, remember that all contact that they have with rights-based organisations is confidential. And it's not as if that once the story gets told to an advocacy organisation or a rights-based organisation, that the story becomes public. That's not the case. If somebody chooses for things to be managed or assisted with by that advocacy organisation, they can assist, whether it be the older person or whatever the issue might be. They can assist the individual coming forward and do things in a very covert way, so that it's not public, it's not harming, and it's not even letting the perpetrator know directly, but about the conversations that people might be having.
Is it
just from what Russell said? So often in my previous life as Commissioner, and Robert most probably has experienced this as well, people with lived experience often aren't in a position to be able to advocate for themselves because of sometimes shame that why is my child doing this to me if it's elder abuse, sometimes fear of their family breaking down in a relationship breakdown. Your side of the family might support you and say, well, you know, you really shouldn't have married him or her, but that's the case. But in elder abuse, for example, you may find it sets one part of the family against the other, a son against a daughter. So it is a form of family violence or family abuse, but it's very different. And so particularly for an older person, but even for somebody in a breakdown relationship, they may feel shame. Well, what have I done to deserve? Why has this happened? But so it's absolutely vital that those that advocate for older people in this area are open, are seen, as Russell said, to be totally confidential. But you need those stories. If you haven't had that lived experience, we need those stories because the press ask you. You need them when you're trying to drive the issue with a member of parliament or drive the issue with an organisation. You need to be able to say, this is actually happening. It's people used to say to me, I can't believe that people would do that to their mother and father. Well, you better believe it because a lot of people experience it. But we've got to have the trust, but we've also got to have the ears to listen carefully to people who want to tell their stories but they don't want to tell it themselves. And so we're their eyes and ears and their mouth and their advocates. But we've got to be able to be open to that, but they have to be open to trusting us as well. So it's a very precious relationship that you develop with people who tell you those stories. And there are some who come out publicly, but I'm sure they pay a huge price for that.
Well, as a journalist, I certainly know that often there's no story unless you have the personal example, and that's true for the work you're doing as well. So, how can we better protect those people? Are there more things we can be doing?
Well, I think the first thing in relation to advocacy, it's changed a great deal over time, and a number of the comments coming up are about this. Advocacy in the very earliest days was often about advocating for people, you know, well-intentioned. Many of the organisations, many of those that were in the, you know, the charitable sector, not only were good deliverers of services, but they're advocates. Today, we see advocacy very different. It's about empowering, walking with, accompanying those that have had that lived experience. I learned this when I was president of ACOS. Every single time we went to see a minister or a prime minister, which was regularly, there would be somebody there who was experiencing the very issue we were talking about, and that made a difference. But today it's even more than that. My role as commissioner here is to give voice and presence to older people, their issues and themselves, just what Kay did. And so really the emphasis is not advocating for them and actually working with them so they have that voice. And that's the most powerful voice. But by doing that, I'm conscious of the safeguards around that. You know, they're not sort of concrete, but I'm very conscious that what they're doing, and often not only on behalf of themselves, but on many others, carries some of those risks we've been talking about. So I think in a sense, we know that their voice is more powerful, much more powerful than mine, much more powerful than Kay's. But I think by walking with them and accompanying them, we actually do provide some of that protection, which is important. For the individual advocate in their own lives, I think it's a very interesting thing that Kay talks about. There's two things that are very clear to me. Older people are not bystanders in the decisions that affect them. They must be involved in those decisions. Therefore, they've got to have voice in those. What have we got to do to give them voice? They're not, you know, onlookers in the systems that support them. They should be part of the design of those systems. So this is really practical. It's about how are you an advocate for yourself in the decisions that directly affect you? How are you an advocate as a collective in the systems that are going to support you? And I think people, in my role in that, our job is to let that happen or encourage that to happen. And I think advocacy has really changed. In some areas, however, you know, peer advocacy, advocacy for self has always been very much a present activity, particularly in the disability space, but it has changed over time.
But I think that advocacy has different forms too. You might be advocating for an individual in a particular circumstance, or you might be advocating for a group of people who are more prepared to come out than those who've been abused as older people or abused in any form. And for example, one of the issues I pursued as Commissioner was housing for older women. That is a much easier, it sounds awful, but it's a much easier to advocate on that issue than it was to advocate on elder abuse, because there were more people prepared to say, I'm in this circumstance, this is why it happened around housing, but not about elder abuse. So advocacy has to be aware and alert to the differences in the issues that you're dealing with, even within the same responsibility. I mean, you know, within the areas I was working in, there were different roles you played as an advocate, because the circumstances were different. So I think that's the other thing that you've got to be very conscious of and aware of. How do you use the knowledge that you gain from being with people who've got issues to then make their circumstances better, because you listen to them carefully and then advocate in the right places and to the right people and with the right supports. It's easier to take someone who's had a homelessness experience to a member of parliament than someone who's been abused. So I think it's a challenging thing, and that's something you don't get taught. You have to learn it, I guess. Robert, I don't know. I don't think there's ever been a course in advocacy. Maybe there is and I've missed it. Maybe I shouldn't do it.
There should be.
I think it requires understanding people, especially understanding the political system. A lot of people don't understand. They come waltzing in February to tell you what should be in the budget in May. It's almost done in November. So learning about the systems you're working within, how does a national organisation versus a federated organisation work? I think it requires a lot of finessing.
We just had quite a number of questions coming in, but one of the ones that's caught my eye: what if the advocacy group you select picks and chooses what it wants to advocate, with the effect in the end of actually silencing your views? So for those of you that suggested that you work through a group, that is a real risk, isn't it? Robert, I see you nodding.
I'm sure Russell's had experience of that. Well, this is part of the challenge of being with a group. The group provides a great deal of benefits, but there will be times when it doesn't necessarily represent your view. That is absolutely true. And so the challenge for that is whether you can accommodate that and they can accommodate you, or you have to find a different voice. And so what we've seen in the disability area, what we've seen in the veterans areas, I did an inquiry I headed up in relation to veterans' wellbeing, many of whom are older people. It was the last inquiry I did with the Productivity Commission. There are over 3,000 advocacy groups for veterans in Australia. And partly that's driven not only because of the cause or the conditions they have, or the war, or the environment that they served out their time, but there's distrust of each other manifestly across them. And so when an organisation no longer represents their view, they create another one. Now, it's the most extreme example where what you've said leads to this enormous fragmentation of advocacy across thousands. But I think it's a personal thing. Not all organisations are right for you or your issues. And over time, they may change, and therefore you do have to find others. And many advocacy break up over time. They go into different groups. I think that's fine. That's what civil society does. Governments always say, oh, there's too many of them, they should amalgamate and all that sort of stuff. History shows us that that's humankind. There is, however, danger where if you're trying to represent the interests of a group like veterans, and there's too many voices doing too many things differently, you actually lose your effectiveness. And so, there is a cost with this fragmentation.
Russell,
I'm sure Russell's had real experience with this.
Yeah, but I just want to talk in the older person space for a moment. And I agree with what Robert was just articulating. But remember that there are a range of advocacy groups in the older person space. There's the Older Persons Advocacy Network, there's EAAA, there's the Commissioner himself, there's the state-based advocacy organisations, there's the Elder Abuse Helpline. So there are a range of organisations already that people could make contact with if in fact their story doesn't connect with that particular organisation and what that organisation is trying to achieve in terms of its bigger picture, then there are other places that you can go. And to Robert's point as well about how things have all fragmented over time, I'm thinking about the HIV sector now and the early days in the 80s and how that looks very different from what it looked in the 80s to 90s when we had HIV meds being approved for use. Things have changed in terms of how that landscape of advocacy services exist, and there are a range of different advocacy services for people who are living with HIV or broader LGBTIQ matters, including LGBTI aging matters. Now there are organisations that specifically can assist people. So yes, things do fragment. Sometimes it's for the better, and things wax and wane. But I think the important message to get across is that there's always a range of advocacy organisations that people can try and connect with.
What about?
So if I could just make the comment about that fragmentation, Vivian. If you want to change public policy, however, it is now necessary to be able to form collaboratives of those different groups. And what I've come to understand is long-term collaborations are very difficult, but issues-based collaboratives are the way forward. And if you look at the disability groups, they all came together around the need for the NDIS. In many other areas, they disagree about everything. They came together about that. We saw the same alignment in relation to paid parental leave. We saw the coming together of businesses, unions, and others. So issues-based collaborations between this diversity of groups is the way to actually try to affect public policy. In the earlier days, it was about establishing long-term organisations, and Russell's mentioned those in the aging space, and they have an absolute role, and I've been involved in many of them. But these issues-based collaboratives actually are very effective. We've seen that in the climate change and other areas as well. So diversity needs to be.
What about in the elder abuse area? Are we seeing it there?
The elder abuse area, there are more advocates in the disability space than there are in the older person space, and I think that's an interesting phenomenon. The challenge at the state level, and I was just doing a webinar this morning with the Northern Territory, who were looking at adult safeguarding for older people, is to bring those coalitions together. They're very important. You're not going to influence state governments or Commonwealth governments about clear and directive action unless there is that coming together. So I think that in the space of elder abuse, it does require all of the organisations to come together at local level or at national level around particular issues, and we are seeing that. So there's a number of, already we're working on a financial abuse collaborative. The EAAA, which is the organisation that Russell's associated and putting on this seminar today, is an example of that. So I think we are seeing more organisations involved in the space, but we are seeing a willingness to work together. And I think that's the magic if we want to bring about changes in public policy.
Are we doing enough to support people from multicultural or multi-faith backgrounds? Surely they're even more vulnerable.
I think the answer is no to that. I think that, and look, when you think about it, Susan Ryan was the first Age Discrimination Commissioner. We've only had 16 years, I suppose, now. And we've seen some of these. EAAA didn't exist when I began. There's been a growth, but I think one of the things we need to do now is to move out to look at how do we. I mean, I think that one of the important things is that students who are going to be physiotherapists and law. When I was commissioner, when I was commissioner, was asked to go to one law school every year to speak to students about elder abuse. I mean, that's disgraceful that we don't have that as a topic within, also usually it's only elective in a law school, we're going to see $2 to $3 trillion be transferred from the war babies. We never mentioned the war babies, but war babies and baby boomers to the next generations, which leaves it open and leaves the importance of people understanding about the need to have their documents in place. In the non-English speaking community, many of them have wills. Very few of them have enduring documents or powers of attorney. And I attempted as commissioner to start to move into the community with information and being at their meetings. But I think we need to do a lot more work with faith leaders, with people who are working in ethnic communities. I think there's an absolute field to be mined and developed, and to make sure that older people from non-English speaking backgrounds know and understand their rights, and I think they don't. One of the other things is I've pushed that people use ethnic radio, that older people listen to radio. They sometimes are not literate in terms of reading, but we had a tremendous help and assistance with the ethnic community radio station, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think we need, a lot of us need to work harder at it.
So if I can just add to that, 40% of the population in Sydney and Melbourne, come from multicultural backgrounds. And so what we have to do in relation to elder abuse is to be working with those community groups that are actively engaged in those areas. They understand their communities. They understand the way in which messages need to be delivered. But most importantly, the cultural and spiritual leaders in those organisations are critically important to whether or not the issue even gets discussed and the way it gets discussed, yet alone getting to the point where they actually come forward and report matters, although that's increasing. And so one of the things that's very interesting in those communities is that the leaders of those communities need to give permission for these issues to be dealt with. And this is a very unusual thing. And so if we don't work with those community groups and we don't work with those spiritual and cultural leaders, we don't even get to the first base. The good news is that in states and territories that is happening to a greater degree. We are starting to see more reports to the helpline from people from culturally diverse backgrounds, but it is a real weakness in our public policy area. Most public policy is still determined by white middle-class, middle-aged men and women, for white middle-class, middle-aged men and women. That's not the society I live in. Not in Sydney it isn't. So we've got to change the way in which public policy changes, but on the ground, that's exactly what Kay says, working with those communities through the medium that they listen to and understand. And we are a long way short of doing that. In elder abuse, we will never solve those problems if we don't understand those communities.
Russell?
I think we also need to...
I was just going to say, at a community-based level, with community-based organisations, even the community-based organisations that are seen as mainstream, I think it's fair to say that they do go to some effort to try and have a diverse workforce and a diverse advisory groups that might be sitting in the wings, and diverse volunteer base. But I think what makes all of this work, and Robert and Kay touched on this or spoke to this, is that those mainstream community organisations make better partnerships with some of the community-based organisations from CALD communities, from the LGBTI community, from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. And it's about having those grassroots connections as well as the leadership connections that Robert was talking about. It's about having a range of connections, and so that there's a whole network of community-based organisations that are working with each other, and they rely on each other to be able to reach as many people as possible in the community.
One of the other areas where we can reach people from the non-English speaking communities, I mean, everyone uses different terms, but that is through the health justice partnerships. Still not available in every health facility, but for those who are listening or with us today who don't know about the health justice partnership, I'll just give you an example of the one that started at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, where everyone was trained in the hospital, nurses, cleaners, everybody, that if somebody said, a patient said, can somebody stop my son coming? He's always asking me for money. Rather than saying, it's not my business, I'm a nurse, or I'm not my business, I'm the cleaner, they would just go to the social work department and say, I think this person needs to see somebody. And the social worker would go up and chat to them, often people from non-English speaking backgrounds. And then lawyers came from the Victorian, oh golly, what was the name of your organisation, Russell?
Seniors' Rights Service.
And work in the hospital with the social workers to help those people. They're there not with their abuser or the person who's trying to take money from them. It's one time you get them on their own. Often they have to go to a doctor and they've got their perpetrator with them. So the hospitals are a perfect place to be able to work with those people to say, you have rights. And so supporting, sometimes some particular areas of people that aren't very positive about the seniors' rights services, they do a fantastic job in accessing those people through, for example, health justice partnerships. And I think I'd like something I didn't do as much as I should have, but advocating to make sure that they're in every hospital, that everybody who goes into hospital well, there'll be somebody there who, if they see them being abused, have got somewhere to report it to the social workers who are trained then to work on it. And they've had, I think, Megan Davis, I think her name was, did her PhD in this area. Of the 400 people during the time she was doing her PhD who were referred, a significant proportion, I think it was over 75%, were suffering quite significant elder abuse. So it's the ethnic group, the ethnic community groups, the faith people are important, but also we've got to work within the systems that find those people, and they express their need to somebody who's not an advocate, to somebody who doesn't know where to go and has been taught all you have to do is to go down to the social work department and it will work from there. So I think there are lots of things that are being done that could be extended.
I'm very conscious of the fact that we're almost out of time, so I am going to try and finish on a slightly more upbeat note by asking each of you, if you can, in just a few sentences, to answer the question, how do we encourage more people to use their voices? We've talked a lot about the difficulties, we've talked a lot about the costs, but we've also all agreed that it is an incredibly important thing to do. What advice would you give to someone considering that step? Kay, do you want to start?
No, I've just spoken. Robert can start.
Robert.
Well, can I just put it in a context? Sorry, can I put this in the context of what we call self-conscious ageism? One of the most negative forms of ageism we have is the ageism we have about ourselves. We no longer believe that our voice is going to be heard. We no longer believe that our presence is going to be valued. And self-conscious ageism, actually, all the research shows, is the most damaging of all ageism. The ageism by others matters, but the ageism we have for ourselves. So the first thing to do is actually believe that our voice and our presence matters. And if you start from that premise, it's only a matter of how you do it. And I think we've talked about that quite a lot. So my view is having confidence that as older people, we do have a place in society, in the decisions that affect us, but also in general conversation around issues and policies. And I think it's that, it's having the confidence to believe in ourselves.
Okay.
I'll have to agree with Robert. I mean, at 80, I don't feel silenced and I'm not going to be not heard. So I think we have to set an example to other people to say, you are just as important as anybody else, irrespective of your situation or your circumstances. And I think I think alerting people to ageism, it's the most acceptable form of ism. Sexism, racism, we all get upset about it, but ageism is the most acceptable form and it shouldn't be. And I think the fight against ageism also will have an effect on elder abuse, have an effect on people's well-being, loneliness, etc. So I think that's the core thing that needs to be addressed.
Russell?
Yes, to have that confidence that Robert talked about. I agree with that. And to take small steps, and to take steps towards people who you feel like you can rely on, and try and make at least an ally to take the next step with.
Okay, that seems a reasonable place to finish for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your insights with us. I know that many people who joined us will be inspired to find their own way to stand up and speak out. And we've got a lot of comments and questions that have been coming in while you've been speaking. We've tried to cover some of those areas, but hopefully we'll be able to get back to some of those people with more specific responses in the next.
And we need to see them at the conference next year.
I'm getting to that, Kay. Don't you worry. I also want to thank everybody for being part of the webinar. The link to the recording will be distributed to everyone who registered and published on the EAAA website, as well as our own YouTube channel. Before we wrap up today, I'd like to quickly highlight two important updates from EAAA. One of them is that all-important conference that Kay was keen to promote. Stand Up, Speak Out is EAAA's next National Elder Abuse Conference. It's going to run from the 27th to the 29th of July next year, 2026. It'll be held on the Gold Coast at RACV Royal Pines Resort. So start saving that date now, or if you'd like to save on registration fees, our super early bird release will be available from the 15th to the 30th of June this year. Details, I understand, will be emailed to you over the next week or so. Secondly, if you're not already a member of EAAA, now is a great time to join. EAAA relies on both financial and community support to continue its vital work, from advocacy and education to national initiatives like this webinar. Become a member is one way you can help drive meaningful change. And for information about either the conference or membership, you can email info@eaaa.org.au, all lowercase. That's info@eaaa.org.au. Members also receive discounts for conference registration. So we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today.